Welcome to Media Chats, a platform for media professionals and experts to delve into trending topics and industry insights. I'm Xu Yawen. China's two sessions, the country's major political event, is taking place in Beijing this week and drawing global attention. During the meetings, Chinese lawmakers set economic, trade, and diplomatic policies and goals for key strategic areas in the year ahead. So what will China's policy priorities and development goals be in 2025? How can China achieve its growth targets while facing external challenges such as the U.S. tariffs? And what topics are attracting global media attention? In this program, we examine China's economic outlook for 2025 by analyzing key indicators in a government work report released at the two sessions. And joining me in the studio is Dr. Li Lun, an assistant professor of economics at Peking University. And on the line, we have Witten, editor-in-chief with IOL in South Africa, and SL Kanthan, a geopolitical analyst and writer from India. Welcome to the broadcast. So, Professor Li, let me start from you. We know China achieved this GDP growth target of 5% last year and is setting the same goal for 2025, about 5%. Could you start by sharing with us your assessment of China's economic performance in 2024 and also what major economic highlights from the government work report this year stood out to you?
Yeah, so I think China's economy is experiencing a lot of challenges and difficulties last year, but overall, its performance is pretty good. We achieved a GDP growth of 5%. We created more than 12 million urban jobs, and the urban unemployment rate is around 5%, which is a decent number. And if you look at for the disposable income per capita, it also increased by 5%. And the price level stayed pretty constant. CPI rose by 0.2%. So overall, it's a pretty stable economy despite of the challenges, the trade war, the tariffs imposed by U.S. government, and also the disturbance.
Kanthan, so China is maintaining the same GDP growth target as last year at around 5%, which is higher than some international financial institutions' forecasts. So what do you make of this number, and how optimistic are you about China reaching this target in 2025?
Yeah, it's a fantastic number, and I have no doubt that China will reach its goals. And, it's so funny. Like, if you read the Western media, you would think that the China's economy is doing so bad. The U.S. Secretary of Treasury, so during his nomination, he said that China is in recession. So how is 5% a recession? That's a fantastic number. If you look at, say, Germany, France, UK, they're all struggling to reach just 1% GDP growth. So this is a phenomenal accomplishment, and especially when you consider the fact that there are so many sanctions and tariffs that the U.S. has to contain China.
We will delve more into the U.S. tariffs and its impact on China's economy and also the world. But before that, Lance, as a reporter from South Africa, which sector of China's economic performance in this year's government work report attract your attention the most, and how do you view this economic growth target of about 5%?
What interests me greatly, Yawen, is China's focus on social rebates and assisting its people. When it comes to the amount of spending, an increase in spending on social grants, on social assistance, I think that, for me, particularly in South Africa, is something that we focus very closely on. Certainly, as a media organization in South Africa, we're very focused on how governments assist their people. So that, for me, stood out quite significantly. The increased spending, the number of rebates, and the number of fuel economy to uplift China's people. And I'm quite optimistic about this 5% growth target. What I'm very encouraged by when I look at China as a whole is the way in which the country is able to really just pull together and unify and work very consistently towards a goal. So if the target is being set for 5%, I have no doubt that China will achieve that target.
Professor Lee, we have noticed that the Chinese government is placing a strong emphasis on boosting domestic consumption. And it has tried to transform from an export and investment-led growth model to one that's more focused on innovation and domestic consumption. Like, for example, we know the two new policies is one of the measures promoted by the government. Like you can trade in your smartphones, your laptop, and other electronic devices, and also for industrial part, they can also purchase new stuff to replace the old one. So, how do you assess the effectiveness of these measures? And I mean, what other policies or stimulus measures that you have noticed also being mentioned in this year's government work report?
Yeah, so according to the Vice Commerce Minister, Sheng Qiuping, the trading program, the two new programs that you just mentioned, contribute to a 1% increase in consumption in 2024. So it's a huge number. So as a consumer myself, I've also shopped online and find these government coupons that you can use to buy electronic devices, to buy cell phones, and so on. So moving on, of course, I think that policy is more a short-term policy because you can't renew your equipment or commodities very often. So in the long term, we still have to depend on, for example, fiscal policy or monetary policy. But fortunately, in this year's government work report, both are heavily mentioned. For example, the government is considering to increase its deficit rate from 3% to 4%, which basically increase the maneuver, the room for fiscal policy, allowing the government to basically implement more measures.
Could you elaborate more on that? Because it's not a very common practice in the international world. Like most of the time, like maybe in some European countries, they would keep that at around 3%. So some foreign medias will be surprised, or they will be saying, "Oh, why China raised this number to 4%?"
Yes. So 3% or 4%, whether that number is too high or too low really depends case by case by which country you're talking about. So in China's case, we have a pretty steady tax revenue, tax income, and we're basically experiencing a very difficult time in terms of international conflicts and international relations. So having this increase from 3 to 4% really gives the government to being able to spend more money wherever needed. So it doesn't have to reach 4%, but it basically gives the government more room for policy.
I see. Kanthan, so we have noticed that among the stimulus measures, the ice and snow economy is one of them. It has been identified as a new growth point for China's domestic consumption. With projections estimating it could reach 1.5 trillion yuan, that's about $205 billion by 2030. So when we discuss ice and snow economy, you probably have heard about Harbin, which is the capital city of Heilongjiang province in northeast China, and it's renowned for having the world's largest ice and snow park featuring stunning ice sculptures. So in your view, what are some key factors driving the growth of the ice and snow economy, like the case that's been very popular in Harbin in recent years, and how can international investors tap into this emerging market?
So the first thing is that you need a solid middle class, right? So people who have the disposable income large enough to pursue fun hobbies, travel, with tourism, and so on. So that's the first thing China has done over the last a couple of decades. And now you have something like 400 to 500 million middle-class people. And those families can afford to travel and to do the ice and snow fun in the wintertime. So that's number one. And then number two is that the provinces, like the Heilongjiang province, they have to spend enough money on the infrastructure, the hotels, the marketing of these events, like the ice sculpture events, ski resorts, and so on. So they both have to go, and they both are doing their job, So the middle class in China is growing rapidly, and the provinces are doing a very good job in the creative tourism sector. And as for the international,
Investors.
the businesses,
Yeah.
yeah. So like, this is a great opportunity, right? So you just have to work with the local provinces to find great opportunities for the investment.
Lance, beyond the ice and snow economy, as Kanthan has just mentioned, China is also planning to boost domestic economic growth through other sectors, such as healthcare, education, or elderly care is also known as silver economy. So they're trying to make services as a bigger driver of growth. So how relevant is that to international investors? Why should they care about China's measures to boost this domestic consumption?
It's a very good question, Yawen. I mean, I think if we look at when you look at economic growth, often the temptation is to look externally and to look at, okay, how much foreign direct investment can we attract? How can we build trade relations with other countries? And I think it's particularly, I mean, I know we're going to touch on, you mentioned we're going to touch on the US tariffs a little bit later on. But all of those things are all external factors. If you look at how you invest in your own people and improve their livelihoods and improve their situations, Kanthan was talking about the growth of the middle class. I've mentioned the rebates for the increased social spending that China is looking at in 2025. I think it's very important that when you see an improvement in healthcare outcomes, when you see an improvement in senior care, when you see an improvement in those very basic but very social outcomes, it does help the spending power of the domestic population. So it's quite important. I just want to come back to the ice and snow
Sure.
economy as well. I mean, recently Harbin hosted the Asian Winter
The Asian
Olympic
Winter
Games.
Games, yes.
Yes, I mean it was fantastic to see, and it's really nice. I mean, when you look at the participation locally of and the importance of domestic tourism, internal domestic tourism, it cannot be understated as a massive economic growth driver. But I think those healthcare outcomes and those social outcomes are just as important to drive economic growth. Sorry, yes. So if you consider domestic healthcare, if you have a healthy population, if you have a population that can contribute positively to the workforce and can then as a result, be a part of the domestic economy, that is a massive driver in driving economic growth. So we can't discount the internal and domestic activity and only look at external and foreign direct investment to help drive.
China is the largest trading partner in Africa, and also like for South Africa, we have done a lot of trades in the past few decades. So in what sectors do you think there are more cooperation opportunities between our two countries amidst China's structural transformation?
I think what's very interesting for us, particularly in South Africa, if we look historically, there's been a lot of investment from China in the energy sector. There's been a lot of investment from China's side in the vehicle manufacture, exports from China into South Africa. I mean, those two sectors are massively burgeoning sectors for South Africa's economic development currently. So it's really wonderful to have a trading partner like China that can identify the structural and infrastructural needs in South Africa and be able to plug in. So if we look at the energy sector particularly, we're seeing lots of energy companies from China who are setting up shop in South Africa in terms of solar power development, in terms of wind power development. We've got Long Yuan, which is a massive wind power energy provider as well. And I mean, these things really help South Africa's economic growth. I mean, I'm sure all of you are aware that we have electricity infrastructural issues in South Africa. So having a trading partner like China to help drive that, and also bringing in items that are more affordable for South African consumers, that really helps our growth as well as a country.
And Kanthan, I want to go back to you as Lance has just mentioned that there are more opportunities. Actually, China and South Africa could potentially cooperate during China's transformation to, innovation and domestic consumption-driven growth model. So, in the case of India, how can India maybe tap into the opportunities in this case?
There is a big win-win opportunity there. And, so you take 1.4 billion people in China, 1.5 billion people in India. That's a huge opportunity for mutual growth. And we have a lot to learn from China, So like if you look at, the developing nations all over the world, they all should study the China model. I was just doing some research this morning, and I found that the GDP per capita of China, it grew 20-fold in 20 years, from 1992 to 2012. And that is just like the economic miracle.
Yes.
Right? And that's something that the developing nations all over the world should be studying as to how China was able to do it. And in terms of manufacturing, the infrastructure, the technology, education, patents, research and development, how to attract, the FDI. So those are all the topics that India should be learning from China. And but they can do with China what China did with Japan and others 30 years ago.
Professor Lee, if we come back to the details of the government work report this year, you probably have noticed that a few new terms have appeared in the report for the first time. For instance, AI-powered smartphones and computers, intelligent robots. So, and it says that here, I quote, the government will vigorously develop new generation intelligent terminals such as intelligent connected new energy vehicles, artificial intelligence smartphones and computers, intelligent robots, and smart manufacturing equipment. How do you understand this message sent by Chinese government, and how could these measures accelerate the development of AI-powered, say, smartphones, computers, and new energy vehicles?
If you look at, I believe, the 2025 Outlook section of the government work report, so the premier mentioned this initiative called AI Plus initiative. Basically, it's combining artificial intelligence to all the sectors in the economy, including manufacturing, including service, and including. And they also mentioned, combining service sector with manufacturing sector. So there are different policies that target this. For example, the report also mentioned, increasing in the R&D expenditure. It also, mentioned, for example, increasing the investment in private companies and private sector. So as we have noticed, for example, there are several other new words that relate to your question. For example, one of them is gazelle company.
Yeah.
It means that, companies that, so the official definition of that is companies whose increase year by year is more than 20% for 4 consecutive years. So we have seen a great number of gazelle companies in China risen up, including, for example, DeepSeek or the Unitree Robotics and so on. So another new word is embodied AI. So of course it's humanoid robotics, robots that can participate in the manufacturing sector. So I think overall, from the government report, the government have a very deep understanding of the market, of the new development of the technology, and is actively putting these measures inside the report to make sure the manufacturing sector is taking advantage of all of these new technologies, and also taking advantage of the policies involved.
That
Yeah.
could be like a great example. I mean, AI plus everything could be
Yes.
an example, like to boost what we always say, the new productive forces, high quality development.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think Elon Musk have this prediction that in 10 or 20 years there will be more humanoid robots than human beings. So I think like if you look at unitary robotics, I think it's going to transform the manufacturing landscape tremendously in the future, because it's very low cost and it can be applied to the streamline for a lot of sectors in the manufacturing.
Yeah. That's right.
Yes.
Kanthan, so as Professor Lee has just mentioned, the DeepSeek and Unitree, they're all like this startups, companies that, because of their like AI model and this humanoid robots are becoming like the latest buzzword in the tech world. But this is, I mean, it's just part of the bigger trend. I mean, China is currently leading in many areas of technology, like from 5G, electric vehicles to solar panel and drones. So, what unique environment in China is driving this new wave of technological breakthroughs, in your opinion?
So once again, there are so many factors, right? So like, there's no one magic bullet. So first thing you need is to have a smart population that is willing to work hard, and China has that. But to have a smart population, you need smart schools, smart colleges, smart professors, and smart parents who have good values. So you have that. And then you need the government policies, right? At the local government and the central government, they need to have right policies and the incentives to encourage uh, the environment. So I've read stories about the local governments would build, would have like a building, and they would make the rents free for startups. So that kind of stuff has to come from the government. And then, like, there is the magical, the ecosystem, right? And that's something you cannot really plan for it a lot, but it has to happen at like the roots level, right? The grassroots level. So when I was reading this, the interview of the DeepSeek CEO, and he said, "Oh, I was just having lunch, and then I called up the CEO of, Unitree, and he came over. And then while we were having lunch, the CEO of BrainCore, I believe, so he came and joined us, and we were just shooting the breeze. But within 30 minutes, we had this like brand new concept, like an idea of how to integrate AI, robots, the brain, Neuralink, and so on. So that kind of the magical the ecosystem will happen naturally if you have the right sort of the people, the right sort of the environment, and then the 2 plus 2 becomes, 5 or 6 or 10.
Also, Canton, I know you have been actually doing research about this. Like, we know this year is the 10th year of the Made in China 2025 initiative. So, how much of China's technological advancement was due to this policy?
Yeah, it made a huge difference. The one thing I like about China And that which, like most of the people do not understand, is the level of the planning in China. So if you look at the US, they go by slogans, right? Make America great again. What does it mean? What is the plan? Like, do you have a website where I can read the plans? They don't have a plan. It's all just, slogans. And then you look at the Chinese government, like they don't have a slogan like make China great again. But then they have the plans and the reports. And then, so if you like go back to 2015, under President Xi Jinping, they had the Made in China 2025. So I'm sure that none of the experts in the US or Europe, they sat down and read the report. But it actually had about 260 goals. Okay, that's with 260. That's like mind-boggling, right? So somebody had to sit down and figure out all the sectors. Okay, so we need to work on the artificial intelligence, we need to work on semiconductors, robotics, humanoids, fourth industrial manufacturing, 5G, 6G, biotech, the defense, the aerospace, drones, batteries, solar panels, blah, blah, blah. So that kind of the detailed planning is just mind-boggling, but it's something that you need if you want the country to succeed. And most fascinating is that you fast forward from 2015 to 2025, so nearly 90% of the goals that were set in 2015, they have been met or surpassed. That's kind of the accomplishment is very rarely seen across the world.
Very well said. Lance, as both Professor Lee and Kanthan mentioned, like we have noticed a growing number of cities in China are starting to integrate AI into their industry and promoting AI plus. For instance, you probably have heard about local government departments are using the technology, AI public servants, and also hospitals are applying it for clinical support and so on and so forth. Of course, on top of that, we cannot forget about EVs, like car makers in China are also rushing to form new partnerships with DeepSeek to bring its AI technology into their vehicles. What do you think about this strong momentum of AI plus that China is building? And how will, this technological innovation drive China's economy and boosting its international collaboration?
I think there are two schools of thought, right? You can either look at AI as a threat or you can look at it as an opportunity. And I think the challenge is that many governments around the world see AI as a threat and don't look at necessarily the opportunities that AI can present. And I think that if you start looking at, like China has done, utilizing generative AI to make life easier for people. I think that's the key aspect here. I think many industries feel threatened by AI as instead of looking at the opportunities that AI can present. There has been an application of artificial intelligence and machine learning in the past. Predictive text is a form of machine learning. It's just the new era of generative AI and now AI plus that scares people a little bit. I think if we go back to just a couple of months ago, the Consumer Electronics show, where China had a massive showing at CES 2025, and you're looking at some of the forecasts where, from a consumer electronics perspective, I know you're speaking about healthcare and public service. But from a consumer electronics perspective, when you're looking at that market growing, the forecasts of that market, some five come back to how do you make life better for your citizens? How do you make life better for your people? And you apply that using AI and AI plus. You can only grow in leaps and bounds.
Well, Professor Lee, we have noticed that regardless that's Unitree or DeepSeek, they're all private enterprises. And how to revitalize China's private sector is one of the core topics of this year's two sessions. And we know, like today, private enterprises plays an important role in China's economy, considering that it accounts for over 90% of all registered businesses and 80% of urban employment opportunities. So, what steps do you see the government planning to take to further promote and support and expand this sector?
Yes. So currently there is a private economy promotion law that is being discussed in the two sessions. So I read the draft of that legal document, and I think what's worth mentioning is legal articles. For example, one of them is the legal protection of these private companies and give them equal status, equal treatment, as the public or government-owned enterprises. So by directly, explicitly stating that as a law, I think it gives the the private economy, the private sector, more confidence, to delve into more ventures in areas that they didn't, for example, have the confidence to do. For example, things that relate to the national strategic needs, for example, the AI or EV development and so on. So they don't have to worry about the entry barriers, something that's only meant for state-owned enterprises and not privately owned enterprises. Another thing is the government report is, or the legal document is trying to provide them investment opportunities and financing support to make sure that these private sector small companies are receiving the financial help they need to increase their investment, to increase their revenue, and so on. So overall, I think it released a very healthy signal that the government is putting more emphasis on the private sector and is trying to reform the market structure, make the market more competitive, make the market a fair playground, which is, I believe, the majority of economists will support this policy because it's making the market more free and more complete in some sense.
I think that would be a shot to the arm for private enterprises who are trying to build up their businesses and also have more opportunities and have easier access to funds.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Professor Lee, when we talk about China's economic prospects, we need to consider both domestic and international environment, right?
Yes.
Like we know since US President Donald Trump took office, we have seen the return of trade war 2.0. Like just recently, America imposed a new 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico and its neighbors, and also an extra 10% tariff on Chinese goods, and bring that in total to 20%. So this is going to create some big issues, right? And we don't know when that's going to end, so far. So what's likely to be the economic impact on both China and US and other countries related when it comes to Trump's tariffs on their economies?
Okay, so I'll talk about US first because it's easier. So I think a lot of economists would agree that the tariff is going to directly have an effect on consumer prices because the way CPI is constructed, it's a combination of prices of all different goods, imported and domestic. So if you add a 20%, 10% tariff on imported goods, of course your residents will have to pay higher prices for their products. And what this is going to bring, of course, the higher prices doesn't just apply to consumers. They also apply to manufacturers when they import their intermediate goods. For manufacturing, it also applies to farmers when they purchase seeds and so on. So it's going to have I predict that a overall effect to slow down the U.S. economy. I wouldn't say how many percent, but overall, I think it's going to dampen the long-term growth aspect for U.S. Now, for China, I think, of course, I think the effect is going to be mixed because for one thing, it's definitely going to increase pressure for exporters, especially for manufacturers that mainly target North America. But we have to keep in mind that U.S. consumer market, even though it's the largest in the world, it's only estimated to be around 30% of the consumer market. So there are lots of other places, for example, the ASEAN countries, like for example, India or South Africa.
Yeah.
So there are lots of new places that are experiencing fast growth that China can export to. And another thing is that I think external pressure usually cause Chinese companies to kind of have this work harder, especially, for example, you see in the DeepSeek example, they developed this new model based on last generation chips and with very low cost. So I don't think that this additional tariff is necessarily a bad thing for all the sectors in China. It may be temporarily hurting the exporters in China, but long term I believe we will have the will to kind of surpass this challenge.
China is a major trading partner with over 120 countries around the world. So I believe if like U.S. wants to reduce its economic and trade with China, China can always increases trade relations with the rest of the world.
Of course.
Which is the win-win scenario.
Yes.
Kanthan, so as Professor Lee and I have just talked about the consequences after President Donald Trump imposed the tariffs on China, Canada, and Mexico, one strategy often suggested for counteracting the economic pressures from the U.S. is to continue expanding China's trade relationships with the rest of the world, as I have just mentioned, like particularly with Europe, ASEAN, Japan, South Korea, and countries along the Belt and Road Initiative. So what's your thoughts on that? Like, what are the opportunities for both China and its trading partners in strengthening these ties?
Yeah, that's going to be the future, right? So if you look at China's trade in goods last year, it was about $6.1 trillion. And China's trade with the US was about 600 billion. So that's only 10%. So 90% of China's trade is now happening outside the US, So like maybe another 5% is actually rerouted, like, the countries in like Malaysia, Vietnam, India, they buy the Chinese goods and then they put them together and then they send them to the US. So like maybe 15% of China's trade is with the US. So, the world is changing rapidly, and it's not going to be centered around the US. It's not going to be centered around Europe. It's going to be a century of the global South, from Asia and the African countries. Those are going to be the hub of growth and manufacturing and trade and innovation and the middle class. So that's going to be the future, and the US is going to become less and less relevant.
Lance, what's your take on Kanthan's remarks? And also, based on your observation, has President Trump's tariffs imposed against China worked? How the trade war 2.0 curb China's economic growth and make America great again?
I think ultimately, I agree with Professor Lee. Ultimately it hurts the consumer. And I don't think President Trump has thought through the impact of the tariffs on his own people. So if we look at the 2018 tariffs that were imposed, it did kind of strong arm President Xi into the phase one deal. But ultimately, the consumer paid a higher price for the goods, the consumer in the United States. As Kanthan has mentioned, the bulk of China's trade is outside of the United States. If we look at trade war 2.0, I don't think it will have as big an effect on China's economic growth as it will have on the United States' growth. And if you just compare the growth forecast for 2025 of 5%, The United States forecast is 2.2%, 2.2 to 2.3%. I don't think the trade war 2.0 is a good thing for the American people. It is the time of the global South. If we look at the strength of BRICS and the growing interest in countries around the world wanting to join BRICS Plus, I think it is the time for de-dollarization. It is the time for the global South to stand up and be counted. And we are seeing a slow decrease in the relevance of the United States. So I think this really is the global South's time to shine.
So may I just add
Yeah, please go ahead.
one thing, Yawen? Yeah, as I think more than the tariffs, what is slowing down China are the sanctions, So, for example, the U.S. Stops Huawei and others from buying the semiconductor chips, or to have them, to place a request with the TSMC or Samsung to make the chips, or the Dutch company is not able to sell the machines that make the semiconductor chips, right? So those are the sort of the sanctions that slow down the opportunity for the Chinese companies. The tariffs themselves, I don't think is a big deal.
It will only, as we have discussed, it will only make China's tech company more self-reliant. Professor Li, so in response to U.S. tariffs, China's Ministry of Commerce said this week that tariffs will hurt U.S.-China trade relations, and China urges the U.S. to withdraw them. So from China's perspective, what strategies can it take, to navigate these trade disputes and reduce the long-term impact on its economy?
Yeah, so I don't think China making compromises to U.S. or trying to kind of downplay this conflict is a feasible path forward, because we have seen that Trump and other politicians in the White House have always seen China as a threat. So I think China, part of the advantage for China is that the globally speaking, the rest of the world is experiencing a inflationary environment, meaning that the prices of commodities are going up. But in China, there's a slight decrease, a slight deflationary trend, meaning that stuff are getting cheaper and cheaper. On one aspect, it's due to consumer demand, but also due to development in the technology, making things cheaper and cheaper to make. So I think China in this economic environment, despite of the tariffs, 10% additional on all Chinese goods, it still have a cost margin. It still have a cost advantage to sell its goods abroad, overseas, whether to the U.S., to Europe, and to other countries. So I think that's one thing that China can kind of focus on, basically to also strengthen the importance of export and import market, especially to countries outside of the U.S. And another thing I want to add is that the tariffs only work if you have like a competing product. If you have the same product in another market, it's sold cheaper. Of course, you add a tariff to the competitor. Yeah, everyone buys the domestic product. But for China, one strategy is for its companies to diversify its product line, to sell things that the U.S. simply doesn't offer. To sell, for example, the 3-fold phone from Huawei that you just doesn't have, or sell the humanoid robot at a very cheap price that you can't compete with. So even if the Trump add a 20%, 30%, or 40% tariff, it still have a technology advantage over the other market. So I think those are some measures that Chinese companies can take.
Kanthan, so there's a view among some U.S. elites that decline of American manufacturing is threatening the country's hegemonic position, and therefore a push for decoupling and rebuilding the U.S. manufacturing to counter China's rise is seen as the way out. So, given that China's manufacturing share accounts for over 30% of the world's total and about twice that of the US, and the overall scale of China's manufacturing industry has remained the world's largest for 15 consecutive years, do you think President Donald Trump can rebuild the US manufacturing, like by imposing tariffs on Chinese goods?
The short answer is no. You know, so most people they still don't understand manufacturing. I did a podcast on what it took China to be successful in manufacturing. So when I planned the topic, I thought it would take 5 minutes. But it took me 1 hour to go through all the things that China did to become the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. And so Donald Trump does not understand that. So he grew up in the 1940s, 50s, when the US was number one in manufacturing in the world for a long time. But those days are not coming back. The U.S. Does not have the skills. It does not have the workers. It does not have the science and the research and the technology. It doesn't have, the infrastructure. Like if you look at the trains in the U.S., you'd say there's no way that they can transport the raw materials or the finished goods, and they don't even have the seaports, for trade. They don't have, the electricity, So if you look at the electricity production in the U.S., it has been stagnant for like 25 years. So there are so many things that the U.S. lacks, and so more importantly, the U.S. is run by Wall Street. The big shareholders who want the maximum return on, the investment, and manufacturing is not a very high margin, right? So, like if you're doing services like software services, you can get a 50%, 100% margin. The profit margin. In manufacturing, it may be like 4 or 5%. And the big financial, the overlords of the U.S., they don't want manufacturing. So it's not going to come back.
So how is that going to, push China to, continue grow and play a strong, important role in the global stage?
Yeah, I read a report from the UN, and they said by 2030, China's share of manufacturing in the world will be 45%. Right? So that's the future, and China is doing all the right things, in terms of focusing on the energy, robotics, AI, fourth industrial revolution, the supply chain. So like if you look at, BYD, so they have 30 different subsidiaries, right? And each subsidiary focuses on one special thing, like one for battery, one for the body, one for the tires, one for the semiconductors, yada, yada. So that kind of the skills in terms of the organization, that's what you need to succeed from A to Z, So that kind of the meticulous planning and the execution is what is making China successful. And the rest of the world, they could learn, but I don't see a lot of people who have the patience or the open mind to study China and learn.
So, Lance, How do trade wars launched by the US, the world's largest economy, against China, the world's second largest economy, hinder the global economic development, especially for countries in the global south?
I think if we, I mean, there's a very sort of political side to this, and it comes down to picking sides. And I don't think any nation wants to be forced into that position. And I think we are already seeing the results of that play out. If we look at South Africa's proximity to China, that already has, and the good relationships that South Africa has with China as a result of the BRICS partnership, we already see that that has put under pressure our partnership with the United States in as far as AGOA is concerned. If we look at the US aid funding being cut, which has had a particularly large impact on our healthcare sector, for example, and some of our other social services, it forces governments outside of those two, let's call them warring parties, it forces governments to pick a side. Do I stand with China or do I stand with the United States? And that kind of conflict is not good for development at the global scale at all. I think that, and I agree with Kanthan 100% when he said, I mean, Donald Trump in 4 years cannot achieve what China's achieved over the last 30. And I mean, it started 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the redevelopment of China to become the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. Yeah, so I'm saying that it took China many decades to become the global powerhouse of manufacturing. And I think that any sort of conflict between two powerhouses like the United States and China, it forces the rest of the developing world, particularly, it forces the global south to pick sides. And anything that drives you to pick sides in a global context can't be good for global development. So I really don't think that tariffs hurt his own consumers more than they hurt China's market and China's economic growth. And I think it causes too much global instability for global development to take place.
And lastly, Kanthan and Lance, this is a question for both of you. So how can international media collaborate to play a key role in improving global economic governance and counter unilateralism and rising trade protectionism?
The first thing is to teach people, to educate people on what is happening and how things work, But unfortunately, the U.S. Still has a very large power over the narratives of the world, right? So how does the economy work? What is democracy? What does it take for the government, for the economy to be successful? What is GDP? Like the basic stuff, So for example, so if you just measure the GDP by spending, then that's a wrong metric to look at how successful a nation is. So, for example, if you have a nation where people have a lot of money in the bank, okay, so that's actually a sign of wealth if you have a lot of money in the bank. So that means the economy is great. But if you say the GDP is only based on spending, then you can have a nation where the people are broke, they don't have any money in the bank, and then they borrow to spend money on the goods that they don't need, but their GDP is great. Okay, their GDP, it grew so fast, right? So that's a wrong measure of what is an economy, what is a growth. And so similarly, what is, the democracy? So, when I talk about China's democracy on social media, a lot of the first response is, ha, there's no democracy in China. Why? because the definition of democracy is defined by the US, right? So there are so many things in the world are defined by the US and the West.
And who says that's the
So
correct answer, right?
yeah, so we, the people in the global South, have to create a new narrative about what is a society, what is a government, what is an economy, what is health, what is wealth, and all that.
Great. Lance, how about you?
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree more with Kanthan. The dominating narrative is a Western-centric one. It is a Eurocentric one, and even in the global South, particularly in South Africa, I speak from experience. Our mainstream media even is conditioned to be pro the West. So I think these kinds of interactions, I think largely, if you look at the media in the United States, they form echo chambers. Whereas here, we are sitting with journalists from China, journalists from South Africa, journalists from India, geopolitical experts from the global South. We're willing to cooperate and collaborate with each other to change this narrative. I think the more that we collaborate and the more in disseminating this information and speak together about challenges facing our multipolar world, I think that is a step in the right direction. But I think critical to that is also the development for me of our own distribution networks. Largely, the distribution networks, we don't own. I mean, in South Africa, we don't own our distribution networks. The West largely owns the global distribution networks in terms of the narrative that gets told, which is why TikTok was such a threat to Donald Trump and to the United States. They own X, they own Meta, they own the largest distribution networks of information. If the global South works together on developing a competing distribution network where we can help shift this global narrative, I think that's also a big step in the right direction.
Very well said. Well, with that, we're wrapping up this episode of Media Chats. And thanks to our panelists, Professor Li Lun, Assistant Professor of Economics at Peking University, Lance Witten, Editor-in-Chief with IOL in South Africa, and S.L. Kanthan, a geopolitical analyst and writer from India. Thank you all for watching. Bye for now.